There is a moment, somewhere around 2 in the morning, when most of America goes quiet. The restaurants have closed. The highways have thinned to a handful of headlights moving through the dark. The television screens have gone dark in living rooms from Maine to California. The dogs are asleep. The children are asleep. The parents who worried about the children are, finally, asleep. And yet, beneath all of that stillness, something enormous is moving. Right now, as you listen to this, there are trucks on nearly every interstate in the country carrying mail. Not a few trucks, hundreds of them, thousands, if you count the smaller routes and the regional runs and the local transfer vehicles making their way between facilities in the dark. There are aircraft, postal aircraft, contracted cargo planes, freight jets with USPS labels on their manifests, cutting through the night sky over the Midwest, over the Rockies, over the sleeping cities of the South. There are workers inside massive buildings the size of airport terminals, standing at machines that process 2,000 pieces of mail per minute, working in shifts that began when most people were watching the late news and will end when most people are making coffee. It happens every night, every single night, without exception, without pause, without anyone much noticing. This is the story of that invisible world. Most people think about the post office maybe 3 or 4 times a year. When they need to mail a package, when they're waiting for something they ordered, when the mail carrier comes to the door with something that doesn't fit in the box. On those occasions, the postal system flickers briefly into consciousness, does its job, and disappears again. That's by design, in a way. A system this large, this old, and this deeply woven into the fabric of daily life tends to become invisible through sheer familiarity. We stop seeing things we rely on completely. The water that comes out of the tap, the electricity that arrives when we flip the switch, the road that's there every morning when we back out of the driveway. The mail is like that. And yet the mail is also something stranger and more interesting than those other utilities. Water doesn't carry meaning. Electricity doesn't carry news. But the mail carries everything. Prescriptions that keep people alive. Legal documents that change the ownership of property. Birthday cards from people who are no longer living. Letters between soldiers and their families. Checks. Contracts. Photographs. Things people made with their hands and sent across the country because they wanted someone else to have them. All of it moving through the same system. The same trucks, the same sorters, the same post offices that have been doing this, in one form or another, since before the United States was a country. That's where the story actually begins. Not in a sorting facility at 2 in the morning, though we'll get there. It begins much earlier than that. Chapter 1. The Quiet Before the Storm Picture. A Tuesday evening in late October, somewhere in the middle of Ohio. It's about 8 o'clock at night. The air has that particular autumn sharpness to it, the kind that makes the streetlights look slightly colder than they did a month ago. A neighborhood postal carrier, let's call her the last carrier, because she's usually the last one to finish her route in this part of town, is pulling her truck back into the local post office parking lot. She's done for the day, or at least her day is done. Inside the building, things are different. The lobby is locked. The retail windows are dark. The little informational displays about passport applications and flat-rate boxes are sitting in the dim light of a room that no one is in. But in the back, behind the swing-through doors that customers never see, the workroom floor is still moving. Packages that arrived that afternoon are being logged, sorted into destination sequences, separated from what's staying local and what's going on to the processing plant. By 9 o'clock, a truck will come. It comes every night. It doesn't announce itself with any particular fanfare. The driver will back up to the dock. The doors will open. And everything that this post office has collected during the business day, every package, every tray of letters, every flat envelope and padded mailer, will be loaded onto that truck. And then it will drive away into the dark. This scene is playing out simultaneously in roughly 31,000 locations across the United States. 31,000 post offices, different sizes, different volumes, different character. There are post offices in Manhattan that process more mail in a single hour than some rural post offices handle in a month. There are post offices in small Montana towns where the postmaster is the only employee and keeps irregular hours that the town has quietly accepted for 30 years. There are post offices in shopping centers, in historic buildings, in trailers parked at construction sites. There are contract postal units operating out of the back corners of pharmacies and grocery stores, unmanned lobbies with automated kiosks that function in the middle of the night without anyone tending them. All of them feeding into the same network. All of them, by the time darkness has fully settled, sending their collected mail upward into a system that most of the people who use it have never imagined. The evening collection, the moment when local post offices send their mail to processing facilities, is one of those transitions that happens without drama. It's the postal equivalent of a quiet changing of the guard. The day shift, which is about customer service and last-mile delivery, and the visible, human face of what the Postal Service does, hands off to the night shift, which is about volume and velocity and the movement of an almost incomprehensible quantity of stuff across an almost incomprehensible amount of geography. To understand why that night shift looks the way it does, you have to understand something about what the Postal Service actually is, because most people don't. Chapter 2. What the post office actually is here is a fact that tends to surprise people. The United States Postal Service is not a government agency in the traditional sense. It is not funded by tax dollars. It receives no annual appropriation from Congress for its operating budget. It pays its own way, or it tries to, through the revenue it generates from postage and services. It is, in the formal language of federal law, an independent establishment of the executive branch, which is a phrase that essentially means it occupies a strange middle space between a government agency and a corporation, without being fully either one. It was reorganized into this structure in 1970 under the Postal Reorganization Act, which was itself the result of something genuinely unusual in American labor history. A wildcat strike by postal workers in New York City that spread to other cities and essentially shut down mail delivery in the northeastern United States for several days. The government, caught off guard by the scale and speed of the disruption, eventually negotiated a settlement. Part of that settlement led to the reorganization of the old Post Office Department, which had been a cabinet-level government agency since 1792, into the United States Postal Service as it exists today. That history matters because it explains something about the peculiar pressures the Postal Service operates under. It has to generate its own revenue like a business. but it has legal obligations that no ordinary business would accept. It is required, by law, to deliver mail to every address in the United States, not just the addresses that are profitable to serve. Every address. The apartment building in downtown Chicago and the ranch house at the end of a dirt road in rural Wyoming, reachable only by four-wheel drive for 3 months of the year. Same service, same obligation. There's a name for this. It's called the Universal Service Obligation, and it is both the defining purpose of the Postal Service and, depending on who you ask, its greatest financial challenge. To fulfill that obligation, the Postal Service operates what is almost certainly the largest civilian logistics network in the world. The numbers are genuinely difficult to hold in your head all at once. The Postal Service delivers to approximately 167 million delivery points across the United States. A delivery point, in postal terminology, is any address that receives mail: a house, an apartment, a business, a post office box. 167 million of them. That number grows by about 1 million new addresses every year. As new homes are built, new businesses open, new apartment complexes are constructed. To serve those addresses, the Postal Service employs roughly 600,000 people, making it one of the largest civilian employers in the country, behind only Walmart and Amazon. Those 600,000 people represent a workforce so large that if you gathered them all in one place, they would form a city about the size of Louisville, Kentucky. They drive approximately 230,000 vehicles, ranging from the iconic long-life vehicles, those boxy little right-hand drive trucks that mail carriers use on suburban routes, to the enormous tractor trailers that haul mail between processing facilities in the middle of the night. The postal vehicle fleet is one of the largest civilian fleets in the world, and the Postal Service is currently in the process of replacing a significant portion of it with new electric and hybrid vehicles, which is an undertaking of almost staggering logistical complexity that barely gets mentioned in mainstream coverage of the Postal Service. Every single day, the Postal Service processes and delivers somewhere in the range of 400 million pieces of mail. That number fluctuates enormously with the seasons. It swells around the holidays, drops in the slow months after New Year's, pulses with the rhythm of the retail calendar in ways that require years of experience to anticipate and manage. But on an average day, 400 million pieces. Letters, packages, catalogs, legal documents, prescriptions, magazines, government notices, birthday cards, tax forms, all of it moving through the same network. For context, that's more pieces of mail per day than there are people in the United States. More than Canada and Australia combined, handled every day, without most people giving it a second thought. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Not all of that mail was created equal. And the way the Postal Service thinks about different types of mail, the way it categorizes, prices, and physically handles different things, is the key to understanding why the overnight system looks the way it does. There are, broadly speaking, 2 categories of things the Postal Service moves. The first category is what it calls market-dominant products. These are things the Postal Service has a legal monopoly on: first-class letters, standard mail, periodicals. The famous first-class letter, the kind you put a stamp on and drop in a blue collection box, is a market-dominant product. The Postal Service is the only entity in the United States legally permitted to put something in your mailbox and charge you for it. No private carrier can do that. It's one of the oldest protections in American commercial law, dating to the earliest days of the Republic. And it's why you've never seen UPS or FedEx putting things in residential mailboxes. The second category is competitive products. These are things where the Postal Service competes with private carriers on the open market, primarily packages. Priority Mail, Priority Mail Express, Parcel Select. These are competitive products. Amazon can ship its packages through USPS or through UPS or through FedEx or through its own delivery network, as it increasingly does. The Postal Service has to compete for that business. This distinction matters enormously to the overnight story, because first-class letters and packages move through the same network, but on different timelines and with different expectations. When you mail a first-class letter, the Postal Service promises to deliver it within 1 to 5 business days, depending on how far it's going. That's a fairly relaxed timeline by modern standards, which is partly why first-class mail volume has been declining for decades, as email has taken over routine correspondence. But packages, particularly Priority Mail Express, which is the Postal Service's overnight product, are held to a much tighter standard. Next-day delivery, or 2-day delivery for priority mail. Those timelines are what the overnight network is built to fulfill. The interesting thing is that the infrastructure that moves overnight packages is the same infrastructure that moves everything else. The same trucks, the same planes, the same processing plants. The whole system runs simultaneously and interdependently, which is one of the reasons it's so difficult to explain simply. It's not like a factory that makes one product. It's more like a river system, with tributaries of different sizes and speeds, all flowing into the same channels. And to understand those channels, you have to understand the physical geography of the postal network. Which brings us to the architecture. Chapter 3. The Architecture of a Network. When most people picture the Postal Service, they picture their local post office, that small or medium-sized building in town, with the American flag out front, the parking lot, the lobby with the little flat-rate box display. This is an understandable association, but it's a bit like picturing the entire airline industry as a single airport terminal. The local post office is the most visible part of the system, but it's far from the most important part, at least in terms of the overnight operation. The real work happens at a different type of facility entirely. The Postal Service operates a network of what it calls sorting and delivery centers, or SDCs in the newer terminology, and before that they were called processing and distribution centers, or PDCs, and before that they were called sectional center facilities. And the alphabet soup of internal terminology can get confusing. But the concept is consistent. These are the big plants. The large-scale industrial sorting facilities where mail from a wide geographic region arrives, gets processed, gets sorted, and gets sent on its way. There are several hundred of these facilities across the country, though the exact number and configuration shifts as the Postal Service periodically reorganizes its network. They are not places most people ever see. They are typically located in industrial areas, near highway interchanges or freight corridors. They don't advertise themselves. They don't have customer-facing lobbies. They are, in the most literal sense, back-of-house operations. but they are extraordinary buildings. Walk into one of the large processing facilities, say, the Dulles Processing and Distribution Center in Northern Virginia, or the massive plant in Los Angeles, or the Chicago Network Distribution Center. And what you see first is the scale. These are not small warehouses. They are typically hundreds of thousands of square feet under a single roof, the kind of space that makes you instinctively recalibrate your sense of what a building can be. The ceilings are high enough that the air near the rafters feels like a different atmosphere than the air at floor level. The light is fluorescent and relentless. The sound is constant. The rumble and whir of machinery, the movement of conveyors, the rhythmic percussion of mail hitting, sorting cases and bins. And there is mail everywhere, not piled haphazardly, but organized. Organized in ways that are extremely specific and that took decades to develop. Trays of letter mail stacked on wheeled carts called hampers. Trays of flat mail, the slightly larger category that includes large envelopes and catalogs. Packages of varying sizes in bins and on belts. Everything tagged, bar-coded, moving with a purposeful choreography that takes newcomers a few minutes to decode. Understanding how these facilities fit together geographically is the key to understanding why mail goes where it goes at night. The postal network is organized, broadly, into a hierarchy. At the top of that hierarchy are the network distribution centers. There are fewer than 24 of these in the entire country, and they are the hubs of the overnight system. These are the facilities that handle the very highest volumes of mail, that connect to the postal air network, that function as the primary redistribution points for long-distance mail movement. Below them are the processing and distribution centers, which handle regional volumes. These are the facilities that receive mail from local post offices, process it, and either deliver it to local carriers or send it up to a network distribution center for further transit. And at the bottom of the formal sorting hierarchy are the local delivery units, the post offices and carrier annexes where the mail arrives on its final leg and is sequenced for delivery by carriers. Think of it like a river system, as I mentioned earlier, but in reverse. Mail starts at thousands of tiny tributaries, the collection boxes, the post office retail windows, the business mail entry units, where large mailers drop off their bulk mail, and flows inward toward the processing centers, where it's sorted and then pushed back outward toward its destination, except that it's moving in multiple directions simultaneously, which is what makes the routing logic so interesting. When a letter is dropped into a collection box in, say, Portland, Oregon, it has no way of telling anyone where it's going. It has a destination address, obviously, but it's one piece of paper among the hundreds or thousands of pieces that might come out of that collection box in a single pickup. The Postal Service's job is to take that undifferentiated collection of mail, figure out where each piece is going, and sort it into a sequence that can be efficiently processed for delivery. That sorting problem, which sounds simple but is mathematically one of the more interesting challenges in logistics, is what the overnight network is almost entirely organized around solving. In the early days of American mail, sorting was done entirely by hand. Postal workers with encyclopedic knowledge of the country's geography would physically separate mail into destination piles, a process that required genuine skill and years of experience to do quickly. There are accounts from the 19th century of mail clerks on railroad cars, the famous railway post office workers, who could sort mail at speeds that seem almost impossible by today's standards, pulling letters from a moving stream and dropping them into the correct pigeonhole in the dark, rocking train, working from memory alone. That human expertise was extraordinary. It was also the bottleneck. The volume of mail the country needed to move kept growing, decade by decade, and human sorters, however skilled, could only go so fast. The history of postal automation is essentially the story of the Postal Service, trying to build machines that could sort mail as well as, or better than those skilled human workers, and the story of those workers navigating the changes that automation brought. It's a story that starts in the 1950s, takes a dramatic turn in the 1980s and 1990s, and continues right up to the present day. But before we get into the machinery, it's worth pausing on the geography. Because the geography of the postal network is not what you might expect. You might assume that mail moves between cities more or less the way people move between cities, along the obvious routes, through the obvious hubs. Mail between New York and Los Angeles goes through, say, Chicago or Dallas. Mail between Seattle and Miami takes a southern route. And that's roughly true, in broad strokes. But the actual routing of any given piece of mail is determined by something much more specific than geography alone. It's determined by processing capacity, transportation timing, and what postal planners call the service standard, the delivery commitment for that specific class of mail. Here's an example that illustrates the point. Imagine a first-class letter mailed in San Francisco to an address in Sacramento. Those two cities are about 90 miles apart. You might assume that letter gets loaded onto a truck, drives 90 miles north, and is delivered the next morning. And sometimes, that's exactly what happens. But sometimes, depending on where that letter was collected, what time it was collected, and which processing facility handles it, that letter might travel to a facility in the San Francisco Bay Area, get sorted there, get put on a truck headed to a Sacramento facility, and only then be sequenced for delivery. The total distance traveled might be closer to 200 miles, involving multiple handoffs, all to deliver something 90 miles from where it started. This seems inefficient, and in a narrow point-to-point sense, it is. But the postal network isn't designed to optimize individual letter journeys. It's designed to optimize the system as a whole. The processing facilities are where the expensive equipment is. The expertise is. The volume that justifies the equipment is. To route every piece of mail around those facilities would be to abandon the economies of scale that make the whole thing financially viable. It's a bit like asking why a passenger flying from San Francisco to Sacramento has to go to the airport. The airport is where the plane is. And the plane needs to fly to a lot of other places too. There's another dimension of the postal network's geography that most people don't know about, and it's one of the more fascinating organizational choices in the whole system. The United States is divided, postally, into zones. Not the zip code zones most people are familiar with, though those are related, but delivery zones that determine how far mail has to travel from origin to destination. The zone system affects pricing for packages, but it also affects routing. Then there's the zip code itself, which deserves a moment of attention because it's one of the better examples of an organizational system that most people interact with daily without having any idea how it works. ZIP stands for Zone Improvement Plan. The zip code was introduced in 1963, not long before the Beatles arrived in America, and roughly simultaneously, with the beginning of the Kennedy administration's final year. Which is to say, it arrived at a particular moment in American life when the country was simultaneously optimistic about the future and beginning to grapple with complexities that optimism couldn't quite contain. The idea behind the zip code was elegantly simple. Give every delivery area in the country a numerical code that would allow machines, eventually, to sort mail by destination automatically, without human beings needing to read and interpret every address individually. The first digit of a zip code represents one of 10 large national areas, numbered 0 through 9, running roughly from the northeast to the west. The second and third digits narrow the location to a sectional center facility, one of those regional processing hubs. The fourth and fifth digits narrow it further to a specific post office or delivery area. This hierarchical structure is what allows automated sorting machines to process mail in stages. A machine doesn't need to know exactly where 90210 is to know that mail going to 90210 should be sent toward the western end of the country, specifically toward California, specifically toward Los Angeles. The numerical system encodes geography. The machines read the numbers and route accordingly. When the zip code was introduced, it was promoted with a character called Mr. Ziep, a jaunty cartoon figure with a letter carrier's bag and an enthusiastic demeanor. And it was paired with a postal reform campaign that encouraged businesses in particular to pre-sort their mailings by zip code, which would reduce the labor required at processing facilities and speed delivery times. The campaign was genuinely successful. Within a few years, zip codes were standard on American addresses, and they've been there ever since. Other countries eventually developed their own versions. The UK's postcode system, Canada's alphanumeric postal code, the German Postleitzahl. But the American zip code was one of the earlier and more influential national implementations of the basic concept. The 4-digit extension you sometimes see at the end of zip codes, the zip 4, it's called, was added later, in the 1980s, as part of an automation push. The extra 4 digits allow machines to identify a specific delivery segment, a block, a floor of a building, sometimes a specific individual address, which makes automated sorting dramatically more precise. The average person never thinks about what their zip code contains as information. They just write it on envelopes and enter it in checkout forms. But to the postal system, a zip code is a routing instruction. It's the first thing the machines look at. Everything follows from there. Now, there's something worth dwelling on before we move further into the machinery of the overnight system. Something that tends to get lost in discussions of logistics and automation and network architecture. The Postal Service, at its core, is a system for moving trust. That sounds like a somewhat grand way to put it, but consider what actually happens when you seal a letter and put it in a collection box. You are placing something in the hands of a system that you have no direct relationship with, operated by people you have never met, using infrastructure you have never seen, on the understanding, the faith, really, that your letter will arrive where you sent it, intact and reasonably on time. For most of American history, that faith was extended to the postal system more completely than to almost any other institution in public life. The Postal Service has operated in moments of crisis that would have stopped almost any other institution. Wars, natural disasters, economic collapses, pandemics. It kept operating through the Civil War, with separate postal systems serving the Union and the Confederacy. It kept operating through the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. It kept operating after September 11, 2001. Even as anthrax-laced letters were moving through its facilities and killing postal workers. That continuity is not an accident. It's a reflection of something fundamental about what the Postal Service was designed to be. Benjamin Franklin, who served as the first Postmaster General of the United States, understood that a functioning mail system was not a luxury for a democratic republic. It was a necessity. A democracy requires communication between its citizens. It requires the flow of information, ideas, and commerce across distances that would otherwise make those citizens strangers to one another. Franklin had experience with this. He'd spent years improving the colonial postal system before the Revolution, cutting delivery times between cities dramatically by mapping better routes, establishing more reliable relay stations, and, this detail is particularly Franklin-like, actually riding the routes himself to understand them firsthand. He was a meticulous observer of systems, and he saw the postal system not just as a commercial enterprise, but as the connective tissue of a society. That vision, the postal system as connective tissue, is still the best way to understand what it is. It's not simply a package delivery service that competes with UPS and FedEx. It's an infrastructure system, like roads, like water mains, like the electrical grid. It exists not just to serve the people who can profitably be served, but to connect a society to itself. That's a different mission than what any private carrier operates under. And it's why the story of the overnight postal network is, ultimately, a story about something larger than trucks and sorting machines and barcodes. It's a story about how a nation stays connected to itself in the dark while its people sleep. But the trucks and the sorting machines and the barcodes are genuinely fascinating. And it would be a disservice to rush past them. So let's go inside. It's 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and somewhere in the industrial outskirts of a mid-sized American city, a postal processing facility is hitting its stride. The evening collection trucks have been coming in for the past 2 hours. Each truck backs up to a loading dock. There are dozens of them along the length of the building, and its contents are offloaded into the workroom floor. The floor at this point in the evening looks, to an untrained observer, like organized chaos. Mail is coming in faster than it can be sorted on first arrival, so it queues in hampers and bins, waiting its turn. The workers here are not the people most people associate with the Postal Service. They're not the carriers who drive the familiar trucks and wave to people walking their dogs. They're processing employees, mail handlers and clerks who work in shifts that align with the rhythms of the overnight network. Many of them have worked these hours for decades. They know this building the way a musician knows an instrument. They know which machines tend to jam, which docks receive the heaviest loads, which parts of the sorting sequence are the trickiest to get right. They also know things that can't be learned from any manual or training program. They know, by feel, when something is off, when a particular machine is running slightly differently than it should, when a batch of mail has characteristics, unusually thick envelopes, or packages that are just barely within size standards, or a high proportion of handwritten addresses that will cause problems downstream. This knowledge, this embodied understanding of how the system works in practice rather than in theory, is something no automation system has ever fully replicated. The machines have gotten extraordinarily good, but the people are still essential. And the relationship between those people and those machines is the heart of the overnight story. Before we go further, before we step up to the actual sorting machines and watch them process mail at speeds that strain belief, it's worth pausing on a question that might be forming in the back of your mind. How did we get here? How did the United States end up with a postal network of this particular shape, this particular combination of industrial automation and human judgment, this particular hierarchy of processing plants and delivery units, this particular geography of hubs and tributaries? The answer requires going back into history. Not ancient history. The broad strokes of the colonial postal system are interesting, but not directly relevant to the overnight network as it exists today. What matters for our story is the 20th century, and specifically the period from roughly 1950 to 2000, during which the Postal Service transformed itself more dramatically than in any comparable period before or since. It's the story of automation, of the machines that changed everything. And it begins with a very simple problem: handwriting. In the years after World War II, the volume of mail moving through the American postal system began to grow at rates that the existing infrastructure couldn't comfortably handle. The economy was expanding. Consumer culture was taking hold. Businesses were using mail for marketing, billing, and correspondence in volumes that dwarfed anything that had come before. The population was growing and moving to new suburbs that needed to be served. And all of this mail, every letter, every bill, every catalog, had to be sorted by human beings reading handwritten or typed addresses and physically placing each piece in the correct destination slot. The Postal Service employed an enormous number of people to do this work, and those people were good at it. But they could only go so fast, and the mail kept coming. So the Postal Service began looking for mechanical solutions. The first generation of automation came in the 1950s and focused on what engineers called facing and canceling, the process of ensuring that all letters in a batch were oriented the same way, facing, in postal terminology, and that their stamps were canceled so they couldn't be reused. This had been done by hand, which was painstaking work when done at scale. The new facing and canceling machines could process letters at speeds that human workers couldn't approach. But facing and canceling is only the first step. The big problem, sorting letters by destination, remained a human task. The approach the Postal Service developed in the 1960s and 1970s was what it called optical character recognition, or OCR. The idea was to build machines that could read addresses on envelopes the way a human mail clerk could, and sort them accordingly. This was a genuinely hard engineering problem in the 1960s. Reading handwriting mechanically, interpreting the enormous variety of ways that human beings form letters and numbers, was at the frontier of what computing technology could do. The early OCR systems could only handle typed addresses, and even then, they made mistakes that required human correction. But the technology kept improving. By the 1980s, the Postal Service was investing heavily in a new generation of automated equipment that could read addresses, convert them into barcodes, print those barcodes on the envelopes, and then sort the envelopes by destination, all in a single continuous process, at speeds measured in thousands of pieces per hour. The barcode-based system was the real breakthrough. Once an address had been read and converted to a barcode, subsequent sorting was enormously faster and more reliable. The machines didn't have to read the address again. They just scanned the barcode. And barcodes can be scanned at very high speed with great accuracy. This is why, if you look carefully at a piece of mail you receive today, you'll often see an orange or pink fluorescent barcode printed at the bottom of the envelope. That barcode wasn't put there by the person who sent the letter. It was put there by a machine at a processing facility, usually very early in the letter's journey through the system. It contains the sorting information that will guide that letter through every subsequent machine it passes through. The barcode, in a sense, is the letter's boarding pass. It carries the routing information in a form that machines can read instantly and reliably, and it stays with the letter from the moment it's applied until the moment it reaches its destination. The implementation of automated sorting equipment in the 1980s and 1990s was not a smooth or comfortable process. It was, in fact, deeply contentious. The Postal Service's unions, the American Postal Workers Union and the National Association of Letter Carriers, primarily, understood from the beginning that automation meant fewer jobs. Not immediately, perhaps, but over time. Every machine that could sort 10,000 letters per hour was, in some sense, replacing some number of workers who would previously have sorted those letters by hand. The negotiations around automation were tense and protracted. The unions argued for job protections, for transition programs, for limits on the rate at which automation could be implemented. The Postal Service argued for operational efficiency and financial sustainability. The conversations played out over years and across multiple rounds of collective bargaining. What emerged was a set of compromises that allowed automation to proceed while providing some protections for existing workers. No layoffs of career employees, essentially, though attrition over time meant that the overall workforce gradually shrank relative to the volume of mail being processed. The result is the system that exists today, enormously automated, but still significantly staffed with human workers who provide the flexibility and judgment that machines don't fully offer. The machines do the high-volume, high-speed work that machines are good at. The humans handle the exceptions, the oddities, the things that fall outside the machine's tolerances. And there are always exceptions, more than you might think. There is something almost philosophical about standing in a large postal processing facility late at night, watching mail move. You become aware, after a few minutes, of the sheer volume of human intention flowing through the building. Every piece of mail in front of you represents a decision someone made, to write to someone, to order something, to pay a bill, to send a gift. The building is full of frozen moments of human purpose, moving on conveyor belts, being read by machines, being sorted into destinations. And the machines don't know any of that. They see barcodes. They register dimensions and weights. They calculate routing paths. They do all of this at speeds that would be impossible to follow visually. A machine processing 2,000 letters per minute is moving faster than the human eye can comfortably track. But the letters themselves are carrying something the machines can't measure. The letter a daughter sent to her father who is sick. The birthday card that arrived a day late but still meant everything. The package from an online store that contains nothing sentimental at all. Just a phone case, a kitchen gadget, something ordered because it was on sale. But that will arrive exactly when the tracking number promised. All of it moves together, through the same system, under the same fluorescent lights, sorted by the same machines, driven by the same trucks. That's the Postal Service, That's what it is, in the middle of the night, when most of America doesn't know it's happening, and we've only just begun to look at how it actually works. The trucks are waiting at the loading docks. The processing floors are filling up with the evening's collection. The machines are warming to operating speed. The workers are settling into the rhythms that will carry them through until dawn. Somewhere up above, in the dark sky over the middle of the country, a contracted cargo aircraft is making its way across the night with a belly full of priority mail express packages. In the morning, people in cities where that plane is headed will find those packages on their doorsteps. They will not think about the aircraft. They will not think about the processing plants or the truck drivers or the workers who sorted their packages at 2 in the morning. They'll just think, it came. That's the system working exactly as it was designed to. What we're going to do now is take it apart, piece by piece, and look at how every one of those pieces works. From the moment mail enters the network to the moment it arrives at a door. The machines come first. There is a particular sound that a large postal processing facility makes at full operation. It's not a single sound. It's a layering of sounds, dozens of mechanical processes running simultaneously, each with its own frequency and rhythm, combining into something that after a few minutes stops feeling like noise and starts feeling like atmosphere. There's the deep, steady vibration of the main conveyor systems, the bones of the building, essentially, the infrastructure on which everything else depends. There's the higher-pitched whirring of the sorting machines themselves, which have a quality somewhere between a very fast printer and a very organized wind. There's the rhythmic thump of mail dropping into bins, the hiss of pneumatic systems, the occasional bell or buzzer that signals a machine event, the ambient murmur of a few hundred people working, not talking much, because the sound of the machines makes conversation difficult at normal volumes. And underneath all of it, barely audible but always present, the sound of mail itself, the soft, continuous percussion of paper and cardboard moving through mechanical systems at speeds that paper was never designed to move at. If you stood at the center of a large processing facility at 2 in the morning and closed your eyes, you might think you were inside a living thing, something that breathes in a particular pattern, that has rhythms and pulses and moments of acceleration and rest. In a sense, you would be right. Chapter 4. The processing plants, the facility we're going to spend some time in tonight, is, for the purposes of this story, a composite. It's built from details of real processing plants across the country, the kinds of facilities that exist in major metropolitan areas and handle the lion's share of overnight mail movement. No single facility works exactly like what I'm going to describe, because no two facilities are exactly alike. They share equipment, share procedures, share organizational logic, but they've each also evolved their own particular character, shaped by the geography they serve, the volume they handle, and the people who work in them. Think of what follows as a distillation, the essential truth of how these places work, drawn from the specific reality of dozens of them. The building itself would be unremarkable from the outside, which is intentional. Processing facilities are not designed to attract attention. They're typically set back from the road, surrounded by a perimeter of security fencing, approached by a series of access roads that accommodate the heavy truck traffic that flows in and out of them around the clock. There are loading docks along at least one, often 2 or 3, sides of the building. 20, 30, 40 docks in a large facility, each one a mouth that receives or emits mail. The docks face in different directions for a reason. Mail arriving from local collection routes comes in on one side. Mail arriving from long-distance transportation, from other processing facilities, from airports, comes in on another. And mail going out, sorted and ready for the next leg of its journey, leaves from still another set of docks. Even the physical layout of the loading area encodes the directional logic of the network. Inside the building, the layout is organized around the flow of mail through the sorting sequence. Mail generally moves from the receiving docks toward the machines, through the machines, into staging areas where sorted mail waits for dispatch, and then out the outgoing docks. The flow is roughly linear, though in practice it's more complicated than that, because different types of mail move through different equipment on different timelines. And the whole thing has to be coordinated so that sorted mail is ready when the trucks that will carry it are scheduled to depart. That last point, the coordination of sorting timelines with truck dispatch schedules, is one of the less glamorous but more important aspects of postal operations. The trucks don't wait for the mail, or rather, they wait for a specific, predetermined amount of time, and then they leave. If mail isn't sorted and staged by the time a truck is scheduled to depart, it misses that truck. And missing a truck can mean missing a service standard, which means a package that was supposed to arrive tomorrow doesn't arrive until the day after. The schedule pressure is real and constant. It's one of the primary stressors in a processing facility, the drumbeat that sets the pace of the entire overnight operation. Mail arrives at a processing facility in several physical forms, and each form requires slightly different handling. Letter mail, the standard-sized envelopes that carry most first-class correspondence, arrives in trays. A letter tray is a shallow plastic or cardboard container, roughly the dimensions of a large shoebox, that holds a few hundred letters standing on their edges. The trays are stacked on wheeled carts called hampers, which can hold a dozen or more trays each. A single truck from a busy local post office might bring in 30 or 40 hampers of letter trays. A truck from a large mail entry unit, a facility where major business mailers drop off their pre-sorted bulk mail, might bring in considerably more. Flat mail, the category that includes large envelopes, magazines, catalogs, and anything that's larger than a standard letter but not thick enough to be classified as a package, arrives in a similar way but in different trays. Flat trays are wider and shallower than letter trays, designed for the specific dimensions of the material they carry. Packages are different. They don't go in trays. They arrive in large wheeled containers called goods-in-transit containers, or in bulk on pallets, or in some cases in postal-specific containers called flat sequencing system containers that are part of a particular automated workflow. The variety of package sizes and shapes, because unlike letters, packages come in essentially infinite configurations, is one of the central challenges of package processing, and it's why package handling has historically been more labor-intensive than letter handling. And then there is bulk business mail, large volumes of pre-sorted letters or flats from major business mailers, often arriving on pallets in bundles held together by rubber bands or paper straps, with facing slips that identify the origin and sorting level of each bundle. This mail has already been partially sorted by the mailer themselves, which is why they pay a lower postage rate. The Postal Service accepts this pre-sorted mail at entry units specifically designed to receive it, and it enters the processing stream at a different point than individually mailed letters. All of this, the letter trays, the flat trays, the packages, the bundles of business mail, arrives at the processing facility within a window that typically runs from late afternoon through about midnight, with the heaviest concentrations in the evening hours. The schedule varies by day of week and by season, but the pattern is consistent. The facility starts the night with a building-up period, reaches a peak volume around 9 or 10 o'clock, and then transitions to a processing phase that runs through the early morning hours. The goal is to have everything processed, sorted, and staged for outgoing dispatch before the morning dispatch windows begin, typically somewhere between 2 and 5 in the morning, depending on the transportation routes being served. That's a tight window, and filling it requires extraordinary machinery. Chapter 5. The Technology of Sorting. Let's start with the letter. A single first-class letter, mailed by an ordinary person, begins its automated processing life at something called a Delivery Barcode Sorter, or DBCS. This is the workhorse of the letter processing world. There are thousands of them in postal facilities across the country. They are large machines, roughly the length of a city bus, though lower and wider, and they run continuously through the overnight hours, processing mail at rates that seem improbable until you watch them for a few minutes and realize that the rhythm of the machine makes improbable speeds feel almost natural. The letter enters the machine from a feeder, a section at one end where workers load batches of letters into a mechanism that separates them one by one, orients them in the correct direction, and feeds them into the main processing stream. The feeder is one of the points where human involvement is still significant. Someone has to load the mail in. Someone has to monitor the feed and correct jams. The machine does the reading and the sorting, but it needs human hands to keep it supplied. Once a letter is in the main stream of the DBCS, it passes first under a camera. Several cameras, actually, arranged to capture multiple angles of the envelope simultaneously. These cameras feed their images to an OCR system, which attempts to read the destination address. And here is where the technology gets genuinely impressive. Modern postal OCR systems don't just read clearly typed addresses in standard fonts. They can read handwritten addresses. They can read addresses in a variety of scripts, a variety of styles, with varying degrees of legibility. They can interpret abbreviations, unconventional formatting, missing information, and partially obscured text. They can handle addresses where the zip code is missing and fill it in from the street address and city name. They can detect when an address might be valid but is formatted in an unusual way and apply probabilistic matching to find the most likely intended destination. None of this is magic. It's the result of decades of development and training on enormous data sets of real mail with real addresses, typed, printed, and handwritten, that the Postal Service has accumulated over years of operation. The OCR systems have been trained on millions of examples of human address writing in all its variety and inconsistency, and they've developed a facility with that variety that is, by now, quite remarkable. Still, they make mistakes. Not many. Current OCR systems read addresses correctly at rates that exceed 95% in most conditions. But some, the letters they can't read or aren't confident about, are flagged and either sent to a human keying station or, in some facilities, transmitted remotely to a centralized remote bar coding system where an operator reads the image on a screen and manually keys the destination information. The remote bar coding system is one of the more interesting pieces of the postal technology ecosystem, partly because it's located in a small number of dedicated facilities rather than distributed across every processing plant. When a letter at a processing facility stumps the OCR machine, an image of that envelope is transmitted electronically to one of these keying centers, where an operator looks at the image, reads the address, and enters the destination information. This happens in seconds, fast enough that the letter continues moving through the machine without waiting, because the keying center processes images faster than the mail moves. It's a neat piece of systems architecture. The physical mail never stops moving, but the routing problem is solved remotely while it continues on its way. Once the destination address is read, either by the OCR machine or with human assistance, the system looks up the appropriate delivery barcode for that address. The barcode is then printed on the lower right portion of the envelope in orange or pink fluorescent ink, visible under ultraviolet light, but not particularly visible in ordinary daylight. This is the barcode you'll find on letters you receive. It's applied in milliseconds while the envelope is moving. From that point forward, every machine that handles that letter will scan that barcode rather than reading the address again. The address reading, the hard, computationally intensive part, happens once. Everything after is barcode scanning, which is fast and nearly error-free. After the barcode is applied, the letter continues through the DBCS to its destination bin. A delivery barcode sorter has many output bins, sometimes more than 100, arranged in a bank along the outgoing side of the machine. Each bin is assigned to a specific destination, a specific zip code, or delivery route or processing facility, depending on the stage of sorting and the type of mail. As each letter passes through the machine, its barcode is scanned and the system determines which bin it belongs in. A gate or diverter, a small mechanical element moving at high speed, deflects the letter into the correct bin. This happens continuously, thousands of times per hour, for every letter flowing through the machine. When a bin fills up, a worker removes the letters, bundles them in a tray with an appropriate facing slip, and puts them either into the outgoing mail stream or into a staging area. Empty bins accept the next letters coming their way. The sorting is done in passes. A letter mailed from Denver to an address in Atlanta might go through 3 or 4 sorting passes before it's in its final sequence. The first pass might sort it to the southeast region. The second pass, at a facility closer to Atlanta, might sort it to the specific Atlanta zip code. The third pass, at the local delivery unit, sorts it to the specific carrier route. And a final pass, sometimes called carrier sequence sorting, arranges it in the precise delivery order for the carrier's route, so that letters can be pulled from the tray in sequence as the carrier moves from address to address. That final sequencing pass is actually one of the more impressive things the automated system does, and it's a relatively recent development. The machine that performs it, called the delivery barcode sorter in carrier sequence mode, or the flat sequencing system for flat mail, sorts mail not just by zip code or carrier route, but by the specific order in which a carrier will walk or drive their route. This means that a carrier arriving at the post office in the morning can pick up a tray of mail that's already in delivery order, rather than spending time at the case, the traditional pigeonhole sorting frame, manually sorting mail before going out. The time savings at the carrier end are significant. Before automated carrier sequence sorting, carriers could spend an hour or more at the case every morning, manually sequencing their mail before going out to deliver it. Automated sequencing has reduced or eliminated that time at many facilities, which means carriers can start delivery earlier, cover their routes more efficiently, and return earlier in the day. This is a good example of how improvements in one part of the postal system propagate throughout the whole system. The investment in automation at the processing facility pays dividends at the delivery end, where the carrier is the most expensive and irreplaceable resource in the network. Flat mail sorting follows a similar overall logic, but uses different equipment, because flats, larger envelopes, magazines, catalogs, have different physical characteristics than letters and can't be processed on the same machines. The automated flat sorting machine, or AFSM, handles flat mail. Like the DBCS, it reads addresses, applies barcodes if needed, and sorts pieces to destination bins. But it runs at lower speeds than letter sorters, because flats are heavier, more varied in size, and more prone to jamming. And it has additional challenges around mixed content. A mail stream that includes glossy magazines, cardboard-backed envelopes, newspapers, and thick, flat-rate envelopes is harder to handle uniformly than a stream of similarly sized letters. There's also the flat sequencing system, or FSS, which is a more recent and significantly more sophisticated piece of equipment designed to do for flat mail what carrier sequence sorting did for letter mail: arrange it in delivery order before it leaves the processing facility. The FSS machines are enormous. They take up significant floor space even in large facilities. And they are genuinely complex pieces of engineering. They handle the dimensional and weight variety of flat mail in a way that earlier sorting machines couldn't. And they sequence it at a granularity that allows carriers to take out pre-sequenced flat mail along with their pre-sequenced letter mail. The implementation of the FSS machines has been one of the more significant capital investments in postal automation in recent decades, and it's also been one of the more complicated. The machines are technically demanding to maintain. They require careful calibration, and the transition to FSS-based delivery operations required significant changes to how postal facilities were organized and how carriers structured their workdays. Change in the Postal Service, as we'll see repeatedly in this story, is never simple. The system is too large, too interconnected, and too operationally continuous to be changed quickly or cleanly. You can't take the postal network offline for a week to install new equipment. You have to change things while they're running, which is like rebuilding a bridge while traffic continues to flow across it. Now, packages. Packages are the growth story of the modern Postal Service. For most of the 20th century, the Postal Service's primary business was first-class letter mail, the billions of letters that move through the system every year. Packages existed and were handled, but they were a relatively small part of overall volume. Then, e-commerce happened. The rise of online retail, beginning in the late 1990s, with companies like Amazon and eBay, and accelerating dramatically through the 2000s and 2010s, transformed the package landscape. Suddenly, Americans were ordering things online in quantities that no one had quite anticipated. Books at first, then electronics, then clothing, then essentially everything. Every order represented a package that needed to be shipped. The private carriers, UPS, FedEx, were the obvious beneficiaries of this shift, and they certainly grew. But the Postal Service also grew, for a somewhat counterintuitive reason. The Postal Service had something the private carriers didn't: last-mile delivery infrastructure that reached every address in the country. UPS and FedEx could efficiently handle long-distance transportation and delivery in densely populated areas, but they found it expensive and difficult to serve rural areas and low-density suburban areas at the frequency and price that e-commerce required. So Amazon and other major e-retailers developed a model where they would ship packages via UPS or FedEx to postal facilities, and the Postal Service would handle the final delivery. This arrangement, called Parcel Select in postal terminology, became a massive and fast-growing source of volume for the Postal Service. In the period between 2010 and 2020, package volume roughly doubled, driven almost entirely by e-commerce. The processing implications of this growth were significant. The facilities that had been designed primarily for letter and flat mail processing were suddenly handling vastly more packages. The equipment for package sorting, which had always been more labor-intensive and less automated than letter sorting, needed to scale up. And so the Postal Service began investing in package processing automation in a way it hadn't needed to before. Package sorting automation is fundamentally different from letter sorting automation because packages are fundamentally different from letters. A letter is a relatively constrained object. It fits within a range of dimensions. It's flat. It has a clearly defined front and back. The address is in a predictable location. These characteristics make automated processing feasible, though still technically demanding. A package can be almost anything. It can be a small padded envelope containing a piece of jewelry. It can be a medium-sized box containing a book. It can be an irregular-shaped item wrapped in plastic. It can be a long, thin tube. It can be soft and compressible. It can be rigid and heavy. It can have the address on any face. It can have multiple labels. It can be covered in previous shipping labels from other carriers that the sorting machines might mistakenly scan. Processing this variety at high speed and high accuracy is genuinely hard. The key technologies in package sorting automation are dimensional weight scales, barcode scanners arranged in tunnels or arches that scan all faces of a package simultaneously, and sortation systems, conveyors, diverters, and chutes that physically route packages to the correct destination based on the barcode read. The dimensional weight scale is interesting in itself. Packages are charged not just by actual weight, but by dimensional weight, a formula that accounts for the physical space a package takes up, which matters for truck and aircraft loading. A large, light package might be charged a higher rate than a small, heavy one because it occupies more space in a vehicle. The scales that measure this work in real time as packages move across them. They capture the package's weight and its three-dimensional measurements simultaneously in a fraction of a second. The multi-face barcode scanning tunnels are equally impressive. A package moving through a scanning tunnel is photographed from multiple angles simultaneously, and the system looks for a barcode on any face. It can find a barcode on the top, bottom, sides, or end of a package, regardless of orientation. This is important because packages don't arrive in a uniform orientation the way letters do. They tumble and settle randomly on conveyor belts, and the scanning system has to be able to read them wherever the barcode happens to be. When a barcode is found and read, the system routes the package to the correct destination via a series of diverters, automated gates that deflect packages onto different conveyor paths. The routing logic is similar to letter sorting, but the physical scale is different. Package sortation systems move slower than letter sorters because packages are heavier and more varied, but they handle volumes that would be impossible to sort by hand in any reasonable time frame. For packages that can't be read automatically, unusual shapes, damaged barcodes, missing labels, there are manual scan stations where workers handle the exception. The workers at these stations are among the most experienced on the floor because they encounter the full variety of what the postal system receives, and they have to make judgment calls that no automated system can. There's a category of mail that deserves special mention because it sits at the intersection of all these different processing streams and represents one of the persistent headaches of postal operations: what the industry calls missent mail. Missent mail is mail that has been sorted to the wrong facility. It arrives somewhere it wasn't supposed to be, usually because of a scanning error, a barcode that was applied incorrectly, or a sortation system failure. Every large processing facility encounters missent mail on every shift. It's not a sign of a broken system. It's an inevitable consequence of the scale and speed of the operation. When you're processing millions of pieces of mail per hour across hundreds of facilities, a small error rate produces large absolute numbers. What happens to missent mail is interesting because it reveals something important about how the postal system handles imperfection. Missent mail is not discarded. It's not ignored. It gets reprocessed, put back into the mail stream, rescanned, resorted, and sent on its way to the correct destination. This adds time to its journey, which is why some mail arrives later than expected, even when nothing dramatic went wrong. The letter or package made it to the wrong facility first, got recognized as missent, and had to take a detour. The recognition part is worth dwelling on. How does a facility know that a piece of mail arriving on its dock doesn't belong to it? The answer is the barcode, specifically the facility's computer systems, which know what destinations they're supposed to be receiving mail for and can flag anything that doesn't match. A package that shows up at a facility in Kansas City destined for Baton Rouge probably went to the wrong place, and the receiving system will catch that. But the catching isn't always immediate. In a busy facility, during the peak of the overnight processing window, mail moves fast. Missent items can end up mixed in with correctly sorted mail and not be detected until they show up in a carrier's route and can't be matched to any address on that route. At that point, they get returned to the post office, logged as missent, and reprocessed. It's a safety net built from redundancy and human attention. Not elegant, perhaps, but robust. The system assumes that errors will occur and builds in mechanisms to catch and correct them, rather than trying to prevent them entirely, which would be impossible. Chapter 6. The Human Element. At about 1 a.m, on a Wednesday night, on the processing floor of a large facility somewhere in the Midwest, a woman named, let's call her M because we're not using real names here, is working her 9th hour of a 10-hour shift. M has worked at this facility for 22 years. She started when she was in her late 20s, drawn by the federal benefits and the pension, stayed because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she liked the work. Not the way you like a passion project, The way you like a thing you're genuinely good at. That has its own internal logic that rewards attention and experience. She works primarily on the package sorting floor, which is her preference. She could have bid for different assignments over the years: letter processing, flat sorting, clerk work at a delivery unit, but she stayed with packages because packages are never boring. Every day brings something unexpected. A package that's been through a flood somewhere upstream and arrived at her facility damp and damaged, but still legible. A package whose label has partially peeled off and has to be hand-keyed from the barely visible address beneath. A package that's been in transit for 11 days and has accumulated so many scan events in the tracking system that the data log looks like a small novel. She knows things about the system that aren't written anywhere. She knows that packages from certain origins are more likely to have damaged barcodes, probably because of the way they're handled at a particular upstream facility. She knows which of the automated diverters on her sortation line have a slight tendency to catch on oddly shaped packages. She knows the rhythm of the overnight volume, when it peaks, when it eases, when the brief pause around 3 in the morning gives everyone 20 minutes to breathe before the next inbound truck wave arrives. This knowledge is not unusual among long-term processing employees. It exists all over the system, in every facility, in the minds of people who have spent years paying attention to the same machines in the same building. It is, collectively, a repository of operational intelligence that no documentation system fully captures. The Postal Service, like most large organizations, has sometimes underestimated the value of this knowledge. When it reorganizes its network, closing or consolidating facilities, as it has done several times in the past few decades, it loses some of this accumulated knowledge along with the workers who held it. The machines are moved or sold. The procedures are transferred on paper. But the understanding of how the machines actually behave, the judgment about when to override the automated system and when to trust it, the feel for the work, that goes with the people. The workforce in a large processing facility is one of the most diverse in American industry. This is not a recent development or a deliberate diversity initiative, though the Postal Service has explicit commitments to equal employment opportunity. It's a reflection of the Postal Service's historical role as one of the most accessible pathways into federal employment for Americans who didn't have access to professional credentials or social networks. African Americans in particular, in the decades when discrimination closed most professional employment to them, found in the Postal Service a federally mandated equal opportunity employer that, whatever its imperfections, offered a more reliable path to middle-class stability than most private employers would. The sociological impact of this is significant and underappreciated. Postal employment has been a source of economic mobility for generations of American families, and the communities that grew up around postal employment in cities across the country still bear its imprint. The black middle class in many American cities was built in significant part on postal salaries and federal benefits. The children and grandchildren of postal workers include doctors, lawyers, artists, business owners, people whose initial economic foundation was laid by a family member's job sorting mail. This history is worth knowing, not because it changes how the overnight system works mechanically, but because it changes how you see the people on the processing floor. They're not interchangeable components in a logistics operation. They're participants in a long story about work, opportunity, and the relationship between ordinary people and the large institutions they make their livings within. The night shift in a postal processing facility has a culture of its own, shaped by the hours and the work and the specific demands of operating in the space between the day shift and the morning dispatch. People who work nights have a relationship with time that's different from people who work days. Their internal clocks are set to a different rhythm. Their social lives happen on different schedules. Their weekends, to the extent that the Postal Service's 7-day operation allows for weekends, fall at different times. Many night shift workers describe a kind of mild social displacement. They're awake when their friends and family are asleep, and trying to sleep when the world outside is in full operation. But they also describe compensations. The overnight hours in a processing facility have a particular quality that day shift workers don't experience in the same way. There's less administrative presence, fewer supervisors, fewer meetings, fewer of the organizational activities that fill the daytime hours. The work is more purely about the work, getting the mail processed, getting it staged, getting it out. There's also, in many facilities, a sense of camaraderie that grows from shared unusual circumstances. Night shift workers have dinner together at 2 in the morning and breakfast at 7. They develop a dry humor about their inverted schedules, their vampire-like relationship with daylight, the looks they get from neighbors who see them coming home when everyone else is leaving for work. The Postal Service has, for decades, been what sociologists call a high-tenure employer, meaning that employees tend to stay for a long time, often for their entire careers. The combination of federal job protections, solid benefits, pension eligibility, and the social bonds that form among long-term coworkers creates a stickiness that few private sector employers can match. It's not uncommon to find people on a processing floor who have worked there for 20, 25, 30 years. This tenure creates operational stability. It also creates a certain resistance to change, which is neither entirely good nor entirely bad. People who have done a job the same way for 15 years have usually developed good reasons for doing it that way, and their resistance to change often reflects genuine operational knowledge rather than mere inertia. But institutions that need to adapt, and the Postal Service, operating in a rapidly changing mail and package market, needs to adapt constantly, can find long-tenured, change-resistant workforces challenging to navigate. The tension between institutional stability and institutional adaptability is one of the persistent dramas of large organizations, and the Postal Service experiences it in a particularly acute form. There's a job in postal processing that most outsiders have never heard of, which is a shame because it's one of the more interesting roles in the whole system. It's called a distribution clerk, and it's one of the older job classifications in postal work. Distribution clerks are the people who sort mail manually, who stand at a case, the array of pigeonhole slots arranged in a large frame, and physically put letters into the correct locations. In an era of heavy automation, the distribution clerk might seem like a relic. And in terms of the volume they handle compared to what machines handle, they are processing a relatively small fraction of overall mail. But the volume they handle is specifically the volume that machines can't handle. The hand-addressed envelopes that the OCR systems struggle with. The oddly shaped items that don't feed smoothly through automated equipment. The mail that arrives in small quantities and doesn't justify setting up an automated run. The corrections and exceptions and reprocessing jobs that are the inevitable tail of a system that handles hundreds of millions of pieces. Distribution clerks also perform something called throwback sorting, the manual sorting of mail that automated systems were unable to route to a final destination. A letter that the machine delivered to the correct carrier route, but that cannot be matched to a specific address because the address is unclear or doesn't exist in the system, or the occupant has moved, comes back to a clerk who makes a determination about what to do with it. What to do with it is often not obvious. The clerk might be able to read the handwriting on the envelope well enough to determine the correct address and hand-sort it accordingly. They might recognize that the address exists but is formatted unusually, and apply their knowledge of local geography to figure out what the sender meant. Or they might determine that the letter cannot be delivered and needs to be returned to sender, or, in the absence of a return address, sent to the Mail Recovery Center. The Mail Recovery Center, we'll come back to this, is where undeliverable mail goes to be processed, examined, and if possible, returned to its owner or its sender. It's one of the stranger corners of the postal system, and a place that generates genuinely unusual stories. But that's for later. The role of supervisors on the overnight processing shift is less about directing individual workers, who largely know their jobs and don't need micromanagement, and more about managing the flow. Supervisors on the overnight shift are continuously tracking the volume of mail in various stages of processing, the performance of the machines, the status of scheduled dispatches, and the thousand small things that can go wrong in a high-volume, continuous operation. They are also the people who have to make calls when the schedule is in jeopardy. When a machine breaks down at the wrong time, someone has to decide whether to wait for repairs, reroute mail to other equipment, call in additional workers, or, in the worst cases, accept that some mail is going to miss its service standard. These are not pleasant decisions, and they don't come with complete information. The supervisor making them has to weigh the likely repair time against the remaining processing window, against the consequences of delayed dispatch, often while the clock is ticking and the mail is piling up. The people who do this well tend to be people who remain calm under pressure, who can absorb complex situations quickly, and who have enough floor experience to know what the options actually are. The best processing supervisors are the ones who've worked every job on the floor, clerks, mail handlers, maintenance, and who understand the system from multiple perspectives. Maintenance on overnight processing equipment is its own world. The machines that run these facilities are complex, high-speed industrial equipment. They have thousands of moving parts. They run for 8, 10, 12 hours at a stretch, processing mail at high speed. They jam. They wear out components. They need constant adjustment and periodic overhaul. The maintenance crews who service these machines work alongside the processing crews, often on the same overnight schedule. When a machine breaks down, and machines break down, the maintenance technician who responds needs to diagnose the problem, source the correct replacement part from the facility's parts inventory, make the repair, test the machine, and return it to service, all while the processing schedule keeps running around them. This requires a combination of mechanical aptitude, systems knowledge, and physical dexterity that's genuinely rare. Postal equipment maintenance is a specialized skill. The technicians who are good at it are not easily replaced. The machines themselves are often surprisingly old. Capital investment in postal equipment has, historically, been uneven. Periods of heavy investment followed by periods of deferred maintenance and delayed replacement. It's not unusual to find sorting machines in active service that are 15 or 20 years old, maintained by technicians who know their quirks and can keep them running long past what their design specifications anticipated. There is something almost affectionate in some facilities about the relationship between maintenance workers and the machines they tend. The machines have personalities in the way that old, complex, temperamental equipment develops personalities. They have tendencies. This machine jams on Monday mornings when the mail comes in after the weekend. That machine runs beautifully in summer, but needs extra attention in winter, when the cold in the loading dock area affects the belt tension. The machine in the northeast corner of the floor has a diverter that's been slightly off for years and that experienced workers have long since compensated for. This institutional knowledge, maintained in the minds of maintenance crews across the postal system, is another form of the embodied operational intelligence that makes large, complex systems run. Not the official knowledge in maintenance manuals and engineering drawings, but the practical knowledge of how these specific machines, in these specific conditions, actually behave. There is a moment in the overnight processing shift, usually somewhere around 3 in the morning, though it varies by facility and by the day's mail volume, that workers call the lull. It's not a full stop. Nothing fully stops. But the furious pace of the peak processing hours eases slightly. The inbound truck flow slows as the last of the evening collection runs arrive. The machines, still running, are working through the accumulated volume rather than constantly receiving new inputs. The pace becomes sustainable rather than intense. In this lull, you can see the floor more clearly, see the layout of the equipment and the flow of mail through it. See the workers moving between tasks, checking progress, making adjustments. See the sorted mail accumulating in staging areas, bound in trays and containers, labeled and ready for the morning dispatch. It's in moments like this that the achievement of the operation becomes visible. In the hours since the first evening trucks arrived, this facility has processed hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of pieces of mail. Letters that came in from 100 local post offices, sorted into sequences destined for dozens of downstream facilities and thousands of individual carrier routes. Packages that came in as an undifferentiated mass, individually identified, measured, routed, and staged. Flats that came in mixed and disordered, organized into the precise delivery sequence that will let carriers do their morning routes without standing at a case for an hour. All of it moving, all of it processed, all of it on its way. The overnight operation, in its own industrial way, is one of the more remarkable things the country does while its citizens sleep. It runs without most people knowing it exists. It runs without praise or attention or ceremony. It runs because it has to, because the alternative, millions of pieces of mail sitting unprocessed while the country waits, is simply not acceptable. And when the processing is done, when the sorted mail is staged and ready, the next phase begins. The trucks are the circulatory system of the whole operation, and they never stop moving. Outside the processing facility, in the pre-dawn dark, the loading docks are active. Tractor trailers are pulling up to the doors assigned to them. The dispatch lists, enormous documents specifying what goes on which truck for which destination, are being checked against the staged mail. Workers called mail handlers are loading the containers, trays, and packages into the trailers. A process that sounds simple but requires real spatial skill. The mail has to be loaded in the right order, so that the first stop on the truck's run can be unloaded without moving everything else. And it has to be loaded safely, because a trailer full of mail that shifts in transit can damage packages, jam containers, and create hazardous conditions for the driver. The trucks, once loaded, seal their doors and wait. Not for long. The dispatch schedule is tight. At the scheduled minute, not roughly at the scheduled time, at the scheduled minute, because the next facility on the route is expecting mail at a specific time to meet its own processing window. The truck rolls out of the dock, through the security gate, and onto the highway. And the night swallows it. There is something about a truck moving through the dark that resists easy description. Not the dramatic dark of a storm, or the romantic dark of a country road at midnight with stars overhead. The practical dark of an interstate highway at 3 in the morning, when the road is lit by nothing except headlights and the occasional orange glow of a distant exit ramp. When the white lines at the edge of the pavement appear and disappear in the sweep of the lights, with a regularity that becomes almost meditative after a few hours. When the only other vehicles on the road are other trucks, moving in the same direction, carrying things the country needs. There are a lot of postal trucks on American highways right now. If you drove the interstate system tonight, any major corridor, I-70 through Kansas, I-80 across Nebraska, I-40 through the middle of the country, I-95 along the eastern seaboard, you would pass them. Tractor trailers with USPS markings on the side, or running under contracts with no markings at all. Moving at highway speed, moving steadily, moving in both directions, because mail always moves in both directions. Most people who see these trucks don't think much about them. A truck is a truck is a truck on an American highway. But these particular trucks are carrying something more specific and more various than almost any other freight on the road. They're carrying a cross-section of American life, sealed in envelopes and boxes, moving between the people who sent it and the people expecting it. And the system that puts those trucks on those roads and coordinates their movements across a continent is one of the more intricate scheduling achievements in modern logistics. Chapter 7. The Trucks. The ground transportation network of the United States Postal Service is enormous, and it operates almost entirely at night. This is not coincidental. It's a direct consequence of the timing logic of the overnight system. Mail is collected during the day, processed in the evening and overnight hours, and needs to be in position for morning delivery. Ground transportation has to fit into the windows that the processing schedule creates, departing from processing facilities in the early morning hours, arriving at destination facilities in time for the next processing shift, or for direct carrier dispatch. The distances involved vary enormously. Some postal truck runs are short, 50 miles, 100 miles, connecting a local processing facility to a regional hub. Others are genuinely long hauls, 800 miles, 1,000 miles, connecting major network distribution centers across the country. The Postal Service does not own most of the trucks that make these runs. This is a fact that surprises most people when they first learn it. The familiar white postal trucks, the ones carriers drive on local routes, are owned by the Postal Service. But the long-haul tractor trailers that move mail between processing facilities? Most of those are operated by contracted carriers, private trucking companies that have won transportation contracts with the USPS and operate their equipment on postal routes according to postal schedules. The scale of this contracted trucking operation is substantial. The Postal Service operates one of the largest surface transportation networks in the country, measured by route miles and annual shipments, and a significant fraction of it runs on contracted equipment driven by independent drivers. These contractors are subject to Postal Service standards for performance, timing, and reliability, and they are monitored constantly. Every load has documentation. Every departure and arrival is logged. Late arrivals trigger reviews and, in cases of persistent underperformance, contract renegotiation. The relationship between the Postal Service and its transportation contractors is long and sometimes complicated. The contracts are valuable. A postal transportation contract can provide a trucking company with stable, predictable volume that helps sustain its operations, and they are competed for seriously. But they also come with demanding performance requirements and tight margins, and trucking companies operating on postal routes have to be extremely reliable to maintain their contracts. The specific type of trailer most commonly used for postal surface transportation is called a postal-specific trailer, though they look similar to standard dry van freight trailers from the outside. Inside, they're designed to accommodate the particular physical containers that the Postal Service uses: the hampers, the flat tubs, the wheeled containers that hold sorted mail. The loading of these trailers is more organized than it might appear from a distance. Mail bound for different destinations is not simply thrown together in a trailer. It's loaded in what postal logistics planners call dispatch sequence, the order in which it will need to be unloaded at each stop along the route. A trailer making 4 stops needs to be loaded so that the mail for the 4th stop is at the front of the trailer, loaded first, and the mail for the first stop is at the back, loaded last and unloaded first. This is called reverse loading, and it's standard practice in any multi-stop freight operation. But in the postal context, it requires careful coordination between the processing floor, where the mail is staged, and the loading dock operations. Getting the load sequence wrong means delays at unloading. A driver arriving at a facility with a trailer loaded in the wrong sequence either has to spend time moving cargo around to get at what needs to come off first, or the receiving facility has to deal with a tangled unloading process that backs up their dock. Either way, time is lost. And in a system running on tight windows, lost time at one stop propagates forward into delays at subsequent stops. The people who plan these loads and who coordinate the timing of dozens or hundreds of departures per night from a major processing facility are doing a continuous optimization problem. Every trailer is a constraint. Every route has a timing requirement. Every piece of mail has a service standard. The plan has to satisfy all of these simultaneously, under conditions that change constantly as the actual mail volume and processing progress unfolds throughout the evening. Most of this planning is now supported by software, transportation management systems that track scheduled routes, mail volumes, and trailer assignments in real time. But the software is a tool, not an autonomous decision maker. The dispatchers who use it still have to exercise judgment, especially when things go wrong. When a truck arrives late, when a trailer is damaged, when a facility runs behind on processing, and the scheduled mail isn't ready when the truck arrives. The dispatchers who handle these situations well are people who have, usually, spent years on the transportation side of postal operations. They know the routes. They know which ones have slack that can absorb delays and which ones are so tight that any deviation cascades downstream. They know which drivers are reliable and which might need a check-in call at 3 in the morning to confirm they're on schedule. Driving a postal transportation route is not quite like other long-haul trucking work, though it shares many of the same physical and psychological demands. The hours are consistent and predictable in a way that some freight work isn't. A driver on a regular postal route does the same run at the same time, in the same sequence, night after night. This regularity has advantages. There are fewer surprises. The route becomes deeply familiar. The timing can be internalized to the point where it's almost automatic. But it also has a particular monotony that drivers either make peace with or don't. The cargo is different, too. Postal drivers are moving something with higher stakes than the average freight load in certain respects. Not that the cargo is particularly fragile or valuable in a per-item sense, though some of it certainly is, but because the service standards attached to it are legally and contractually meaningful. A freight driver who arrives an hour late might inconvenience a customer. A postal driver who arrives an hour late might cause thousands of pieces of priority mail to miss their delivery commitment. That awareness shapes how good postal transportation drivers approach their work. They build time buffers into their mental scheduling. They know exactly which parts of their route are most vulnerable to delays. The scale stations, where DOT inspections add unpredictable time. The urban stretches where even overnight traffic can slow things down. The facility docks that are chronically backed up on certain days of the week. They plan for these things, which requires paying close attention over time. There is a less obvious dimension of the ground transportation network that's worth understanding, because it illuminates something about how the Postal Service thinks about geography. Not all postal surface transportation is long haul. A significant portion of the ground network consists of short-haul feeder routes, the routes that connect local post offices to their regional processing facility, and that connect smaller processing facilities to larger ones. These routes are shorter, typically under 2 hours of driving time, and they run on a different schedule than the long-haul runs. The feeder routes tend to run in the late afternoon and evening, picking up the day's collection from local offices and delivering it to the processing facilities in time for the overnight processing shift. They're the first link in the chain. Without them, the processing facilities would have nothing to process. And they run again in the early morning, in the opposite direction, delivering sorted mail from the processing facilities back to the local delivery units so that carriers can begin their routes. This bidirectional flow is fundamental to the system's logic, and it means that the ground transportation network never really has a direction of travel. It's always moving mail in both directions simultaneously. Trucks going out past trucks coming in. Routes that ran from west to east in the evening run from east to west in the morning. The network breathes, inhaling the day's collection in the evening, exhaling sorted mail in the morning. There's a specific type of truck route that most people have never heard of, but that plays a crucial role in the postal ground network. It's called a highway contract route, abbreviated HCR, and it's one of the older forms of postal transportation contracting in American history. Highway contract routes are the ground-level equivalent of what airmail contracts were to the aviation industry in the 1920s and 1930s. They're contracts awarded to private carriers, sometimes individuals, sometimes small companies, sometimes large trucking firms, to carry mail over specific routes on specific schedules. The Postal Service has used this contracting model for over a century, and the highway contract route system is one of the ways the Postal Service reaches parts of the country that would be impractical to serve with its own vehicles and employees. In rural areas particularly, highway contract routes can cover enormous distances. A single HCR might serve dozens of small post offices spread across hundreds of miles of rural geography, running mail out from a regional hub and returning outgoing mail for processing. The drivers on these routes are often deeply embedded in the communities they serve. They know the postmasters at every stop. They know the local road conditions. They know which roads wash out in spring and which are impassable in winter. They're also, frequently, the only regular connection some small rural post offices have to the larger postal network. In a remote area, the arrival of the contract route driver isn't just a logistics event. It's a daily connection to the wider world. The coordination of all this ground transportation, thousands of routes running simultaneously across the entire country, requires a level of systems management that's hard to visualize from the outside. The Postal Service's transportation management operates through a network of what are called transportation networks, managed at the district and area levels. Each area manages the transportation serving its geographic region, coordinating with processing facilities, managing contractor performance, adjusting routes when volume patterns change, handling the daily cascade of small disruptions that are inevitable in any large transportation system. Weather is one of the most significant variables these managers deal with. A snowstorm in the Midwest can shut down stretches of interstate highway, forcing rerouting of dozens of truck runs simultaneously. A hurricane on the Gulf Coast can close entire mail processing facilities and require regional redistribution of mail volume. An ice storm in the South, which can be more disruptive than a snowstorm in some ways because Southern infrastructure is less prepared for ice, can back up the ground network for days. The Postal Service has learned, over decades of dealing with weather events, that recovery from a major disruption is its own operational challenge. It's not just about getting through the storm. It's about processing the accumulated backlog afterward, the mail that piled up during the disruption, which has to be processed and delivered in addition to the normal daily volume. This backlog can persist for days after a weather event, and managing it requires careful prioritization. First class and priority mail comes first, because it has the most demanding service standards. Chapter 8. Airmail. Here is something worth knowing about American aviation history. The United States Airmail Service, which began in 1918 as an experimental military operation flying Army aircraft between New York and Washington, was one of the foundational institutions of the American aviation industry. The early airmail pilots, flying open cockpit biplanes in conditions that modern aviation safety standards would find horrifying, established the routes and demonstrated the possibilities that commercial aviation would later follow. The airmail service killed a lot of those pilots. The early years of airmail flying were genuinely dangerous, conducted in aircraft that were unreliable by any standard, over terrain that offered few emergency landing options, in weather that the pilots had limited means of avoiding or even fully anticipating. The attrition was terrible. Out of the first 40 airmail pilots hired by the Post Office Department, 31 died in crashes. The profession attracted a particular type of person, adventurous, fatalistic, souled, and slightly reckless, and it burned through them at a shocking rate. But the airmail kept flying, because it mattered. The speed advantage that air transportation offered over ground transportation, days, in some cases weeks, reduced to hours, was transformative for commerce and communication. Businesses that used the mail for time-sensitive correspondence were willing to pay significantly more for airmail service. The Postal Service recognized the value and pushed the development of the infrastructure, the routes, the beacons, the emergency landing fields, that made reliable airmail service possible. The development of the transcontinental airmail route, connecting New York to San Francisco, is one of the genuinely epic stories in American transportation history. The route was established in stages, pushing westward through the Alleghenies, across the Midwest, over the Rockies, to the Pacific. Night flying was initially avoided. The pilots had no instrument navigation, no reliable lighting, no weather forecasting worth the name. Then, in a remarkable feat of infrastructure construction, the government erected a series of light beacons across the entire continental route, a chain of rotating lights based every 10 to 15 miles that allowed pilots to navigate at night by following the lights from one to the next. The transcontinental airmail route lit up for night flying in 1924. It was the first time aircraft had regularly crossed the continent in the dark. It cut the New York to San Francisco transit time to roughly 30 hours, roughly the same as an automobile making the drive today, though the automobile wasn't quite up to making that drive in 1924. That legacy of air transportation as the speed backbone of the postal system is still present in the overnight network today, though the aircraft are somewhat more sophisticated than biplanes, and the navigation relies on GPS rather than rotating beacons in the desert. The modern postal air network is not what most people imagine. Many people, if they think about postal air transportation at all, picture the large cargo aircraft operated by FedEx or UPS, the overnight express networks with their own dedicated fleets, their own airports in some cases, their own logistics systems. The FedEx Super Hub in Memphis is famous. The UPS World Port in Louisville is legendary in logistics circles, and they operate at a scale that's extraordinary. The Postal Service's air network operates differently. The USPS does not own a commercial aircraft fleet. It contracts with commercial airlines and cargo carriers to carry mail in the belly holds of passenger aircraft and on dedicated cargo flights. This is a deliberate choice, rooted in the economics of operating an air network. Owning and maintaining a fleet of cargo aircraft requires enormous capital investment, significant maintenance infrastructure, and the ability to manage aircraft operations, something the Postal Service decided was not its core competency. Instead, it pays for transportation capacity on existing aircraft, which means it benefits from the extensive network of routes that commercial airlines fly without having to build and maintain that network itself. The arrangements are called air transportation contracts, and they cover everything from the small regional aircraft that carry priority mail express packages overnight between mid-sized cities to the dedicated wide-body cargo freighters that handle transcontinental mail volumes. The airline side of these arrangements is, from the carrier's perspective, a useful way to monetize belly cargo capacity, the space in the lower hold of passenger aircraft that isn't being used for checked baggage. A passenger aircraft flying from Chicago to Los Angeles has a certain amount of belly space that can carry cargo, and that space would otherwise go empty or be used for less time-sensitive freight. Postal contracts provide a reliable, high-volume customer for that space. For Priority Mail Express, the Postal Service's overnight product, with a guaranteed next business day delivery commitment, air transportation is the only way to fulfill the service standard across long distances. You cannot drive mail from New York to Los Angeles overnight. The distance is simply too great. You can fly it, and that's how it gets there. The routing of airmail is coordinated through the Postal Service's Air Network Management, which tracks contracted flight capacity, mail volumes, and service requirements, and allocates mail to specific flights accordingly. The practical operation looks like this. A batch of Priority Mail Express packages accepted at a postal facility in Boston, destined for addresses in Arizona, needs to be on a plane from a Boston area airport. The packages are processed, sorted, and transported to the airport in time to meet the flight's cargo cutoff time, the deadline by which cargo must be checked in and cleared before departure. At the airport, postal staff or contract handlers take custody of the mail, handle the documentation required for any cargo shipment, and physically load it onto the aircraft or deliver it to the airline's cargo operation for loading. The mail travels in the belly of the plane or in the cargo hold of a dedicated freighter across the country overnight. At the destination airport, it's unloaded and transferred to postal vehicles or to contracted ground transport and taken to the local processing facility or directly to the delivery unit. All of this has to happen within the timing constraints set by the service standard. A Priority Mail Express package accepted by 5 p.m. is guaranteed to arrive by the following day. That means the package needs to make a flight that night, land at the destination, clear the airport, make it to the delivery unit, be sequenced for delivery, and be on a carrier's route by morning. The window is tighter than it sounds. Add a cargo cutoff that might be 2 hours before departure, a flight time of 5 or 6 hours for a transcontinental route, time on the ground at the destination, and the transport to the delivery unit. And you begin to appreciate how precisely the timing has to work. There is very little slack in a Priority Mail Express transit. Every step has to execute on time. When it does, it seems like a miracle of logistics. When it doesn't, when a flight is delayed, or a package misses its cutoff, or ground transport from the airport hits unexpected traffic, the service standard is missed. And the Postal Service, unlike a private carrier, has explicit service guarantees that mean a missed standard is a refundable postage event. There's an aspect of the postal air network that doesn't get much attention, but that illuminates something important about how the system handles the tension between scale and reach. Not every city the Postal Service serves has air transportation available on the schedule the overnight network requires. For smaller cities, for regional centers, for the many American cities that have commercial airports, but not the flight frequency of a major hub, the available flights may not align with the postal timing requirements. A city might have a direct flight to a major hub at 9 in the morning, but nothing departing overnight. That doesn't serve the Priority Mail Express network. The solution, in some cases, is to drive the mail to a larger city that does have the right flight. This adds time and complexity. A Priority Mail Express package in a mid-sized city might be driven 2 or 3 hours to a hub airport before being placed on an overnight flight. The total transit time is longer than it would be from the hub city itself, which is why the Postal Service's delivery commitment maps, showing which origin and destination combinations qualify for next-day delivery, are more complicated than a simple distance chart. In other cases, the solution is a combination of surface and air transportation that's carefully calibrated to meet the service standard for that specific origin-destination pair. Some packages fly part of the way and drive part of the way, with the split determined by network planners optimizing for the combination of cost and service. This kind of hybrid routing is invisible to the customer, who sees only the delivery commitment on the label. But behind that commitment is a specific routing plan, constructed by network planners, that specifies exactly how that package is supposed to move from origin to destination within the time window. There's a historical wrinkle in the postal air story that's worth pausing on because it reveals something about the relationship between the Postal Service and the private sector that most people don't know. In the early years of commercial aviation, the airmail contracts that the Post Office Department awarded were one of the primary revenue sources for the fledgling aviation industry. The airlines, many of which would later become the major carriers we know today, survived their early years partly because the government was paying them to carry mail. United Airlines, American Airlines, TWA, Eastern, all of them had their early financial foundations partly built on airmail revenue. Then, in 1934, there was a scandal. Investigations revealed that the original airmail contracts had been awarded through a process that involved collusion among the major airlines, effectively dividing routes among themselves without competitive bidding. President Franklin Roosevelt, characteristically decisive in his response to this kind of thing, canceled all the existing airmail contracts and ordered the Army Air Corps to fly the mail. The Army Air Corps, as it turned out, was not ready to fly the mail. Its pilots weren't trained for the kinds of routes and schedules commercial airmail required, and the aircraft weren't equipped for instrument flying in bad weather. In the first few weeks of Army airmail, a dozen pilots died in crashes. Roosevelt, faced with a public relations disaster he hadn't anticipated, eventually allowed the commercial carriers back in, under new contracts with stricter anti-collusion requirements. But the episode left a lasting impression on how the government managed its relationship with the commercial aviation industry, and it was one of the events that prompted serious investment in aviation safety standards and instrument flying training. The airmail scandals of the 1930s also indirectly contributed to the development of independent aviation regulation, the structures that eventually became the Federal Aviation Administration. One crisis, decades of consequences. Chapter 9. The Long Haul. Let's follow a specific package, not a real one. We can't track a real person's mail, and it wouldn't be appropriate to try, but a representative one. A package that illustrates the cross-country journey that happens every night for millions of pieces of mail while the country sleeps. Our package is a priority mail package. Not express, just standard priority mail with a 2 to 3 day delivery commitment. It's a medium-sized box, about 12 inches by 10 by 6, weighing 3 pounds. It contains something a person in Seattle sent to someone in Nashville. Something purchased online, as most packages are these days, from a small business that uses the Postal Service's commercial platform. The package was dropped off at a Seattle post office on a Monday afternoon. The retail clerk accepted it, weighed it, scanned it, applied a priority mail label with the destination barcode, and put it in the outgoing area. That evening, the feeder truck came and picked it up along with the rest of the office's outgoing mail. From the local post office, the package went to the Seattle Processing and Distribution Center. It arrived there late on Monday evening, went through the package sorting operation, scanned, dimensionally measured, routed, and was sorted to a container bound for a network distribution center. Which network distribution center? That depends on the routing logic for the specific origin-destination pair. Seattle to Nashville might route through the NDC in Los Angeles, or through Denver, or through Chicago, depending on the transportation schedules available and the network configuration at the time. Let's say it routes through Chicago. The package went into a container with other Pacific Northwest mail bound for Midwest and Eastern destinations. That container was loaded onto a trailer that left the Seattle facility in the early morning hours of Tuesday, drove to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and was loaded into the belly of a contracted cargo flight. The flight landed in Chicago early Tuesday morning. The container was unloaded, taken to the Chicago Network Distribution Center, and the package was processed again, rescanned, its routing confirmed, sorted to the appropriate outbound stream for Nashville. From Chicago, the package moved by surface, a long-haul truck, departing Tuesday morning or early afternoon, headed southeast. The truck run from Chicago to Nashville is roughly 7 to 8 hours of driving, following I-65 south through Indiana and Kentucky. The truck arrived at the Nashville Processing and Distribution Center on Tuesday evening. At the Nashville facility, the package was processed for the final time in the main network, sorted to the carrier route that serves the destination address, staged for outgoing dispatch, loaded onto a local delivery truck early Wednesday morning. Wednesday morning, the carrier on that route loaded the package along with the rest of the route's mail, drove to the delivery address, and knocked on the door. 2 days, Seattle to Nashville. 3 sorting events, 2 major transportation legs, and the package arrived on the day the tracking number said it would. This is the system working exactly as designed. The relay system, the way mail moves through multiple facilities in sequence, each adding a layer of sorting toward the final destination, is one of the oldest ideas in postal operations, and it predates the modern network by centuries. The concept of a relay, in transportation terms, is ancient. Before automobiles, before railroads, before any mechanized transportation, mail moved across distances by horse relay, a series of riders and horses stationed at intervals along a route, each taking the mail a set distance before handing it to the next relay. The famous Pony Express, which ran for about 18 months in 1860 and 1861, was essentially a relay system, riders covering about 75 to 100 miles each before handing the mail to the next rider. The Pony Express is the best remembered of the early American mail relay systems, and its legend is somewhat larger than its operational significance. It was superseded quickly by the telegraph, which could transmit messages, though not physical mail, essentially instantaneously. But the relay concept it embodied has never stopped being the fundamental logic of the postal system. The names and the technologies have changed. The principle, each node in the network takes the mail, processes it, and passes it along, has remained constant. The modern relay is, in many ways, more interesting than the Pony Express version, because the nodes in the modern system do something more than simply pass mail along. They sort it. They transform it from an undifferentiated incoming mass into an increasingly organized outgoing stream. Each pass through a sorting facility narrows the geographic destination of the mail, the way a river system narrows as tributaries join the main channel. A letter moving from San Francisco to New York might arrive at the first sorting facility sorted only to the general East region. At the next facility, it's sorted to the New York metropolitan area. At a New York area facility, it's sorted to a specific zip code. At the local delivery unit, it's sorted to a specific carrier route in carrier delivery sequence. Each step reduces the sorting problem from a national geographic question to a local one. This hierarchical approach to sorting is not unique to the Postal Service. It's common in logistics networks generally. But the Postal Service's version of it is notable for its scale and its age. The basic hierarchy of national to regional to local has been the organizing principle of American mail sorting for over a century. The nighttime geography of postal transportation has its own rhythm and its own landmarks, known to the drivers and dispatchers who operate within it. The major truck corridors, the routes that carry the heaviest postal surface mail volumes, tend to follow the country's primary interstate arteries. I-95 along the East Coast, I-80 and I-90 across the northern tier, I-40 and I-20 across the south, I-70 and I-80 through the heart of the Midwest, I-5 along the West Coast. These are the highways that connect the major population centers, and they are, predictably, where postal transportation concentrates. But there are also the less traveled corridors, the routes that serve the middle distances and the regional connections that don't follow the obvious population geography. A route from Salt Lake City to Boise. A route from Memphis to Little Rock. A route from Albuquerque to Phoenix. These are the connective tissue of the regional postal network, carrying smaller volumes to smaller facilities that nonetheless need to receive and dispatch mail on the overnight schedule. The drivers on these regional routes often know their stretches of highway with the particularity of long acquaintance. They know where the road gets rough. They know where wait station hours are and which nights the inspectors are likely to be out. They know where the all-night truck stops are and which ones have decent coffee and which ones have the best breakfast at the end of the shift. They know which parts of their route feel different at different times of year. The particular emptiness of a Wyoming highway in February, the relative bustle of the same highway in August when vacation traffic fills the campgrounds along the way. This knowledge is part of what makes experienced drivers valuable in the postal transportation network. Not just the ability to drive, anyone can learn to drive, but the accumulated understanding of a route that comes from driving it hundreds of times under varying conditions. There's a dimension of the overnight ground transportation network that doesn't get discussed in most treatments of postal logistics. And it's one of the more interesting quirks of the system. The Postal Service operates under a set of transportation constraints that have nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with labor agreements and federal employment law. The workers who drive postal-owned vehicles, as opposed to contractor vehicles, are covered by collective bargaining agreements that specify, among other things, their hours, their routes, and their working conditions. The workers who load and unload mail at the processing facilities are covered by different agreements. The interaction between these agreements and the operational requirements of the overnight network creates constraints that network planners have to account for. For example, a driver can only drive for a certain number of hours before being required to take a rest break, under both federal transportation regulations and postal labor agreements. On a long route, the timing of those breaks has to be built into the route plan. If the route is too long for a single driver to complete within the allowed hours, either the route has to be shortened or a relay has to be arranged. One driver takes the load to a midpoint, hands it off to another driver who completes the run. The relay driver system, in some parts of the postal ground network, is a real operational feature. On long routes where a single driver can't complete the run within hours of service limits, facilities at the midpoint serve as exchange points. The outgoing driver meets the incoming driver. The cargo is transferred, or in some cases, the drivers simply swap seats and the same trailer continues in both directions, and both drivers return to their origin points. These relay points are sometimes postal facilities, sometimes truck stops, or rest areas designated for the purpose. They are quiet, functional places that most Americans drive past without knowing they exist. At 2 or 3 in the morning, a pair of truck drivers makes a brief connection in a parking lot off an interstate exchange. a transaction that takes maybe 15 minutes. And then each drives back the way they came. Between them, they've moved a trailer of mail across a distance that neither could have covered alone within the legal hours. Extreme weather deserves more attention than it usually gets in discussions of postal operations, because weather is the single largest source of variability in a system that is otherwise highly controlled. Snow is the obvious one. The Postal Service's famous creed, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds," is, incidentally, not an official motto. It's a phrase inscribed on the General Post Office building in New York City, adapted from a description of Persian royal messengers written by Herodotus in the 5th century BC. The Postal Service has no official motto, but the sentiment has attached itself to the institution so completely that most people believe it is official. And the sentiment is largely, if not absolutely, accurate. The Postal Service does continue operating in conditions that would shut down most businesses. But it also, when conditions become genuinely dangerous, makes the safety call and suspends delivery. What happens to the mail during a suspension is interesting. It doesn't stop. The processing facilities, which are typically in safer locations than the delivery routes, in urban industrial areas with large parking lots and professional snow removal equipment, generally continue operating. Mail keeps moving through the network. It's the last mile, the carrier routes, that suspend, and the mail that would have been delivered during a suspension gets held at the delivery unit until the suspension lifts. The backlog that accumulates during even a one-day suspension can take 2 or 3 days to work through. The day after a suspension, carriers are handling their normal volume plus the held mail from the day before, while simultaneously receiving new mail from that morning's dispatch. The physical logistics of managing this, how to prioritize, how to sequence, how to ensure that time-sensitive mail moves to the front, is a challenge that delivery units handle differently depending on their size, their supervisory culture, and the experience of their carriers. There's one more aspect of the overnight ground network that's worth mentioning, because it's both practically important and relatively unknown. The Postal Service operates what are called plant-loaded dispatches, in which mail is loaded directly at the processing facility into trays or containers already sequenced for specific carrier routes, bypassing some of the traditional intermediate handling steps. This requires tight coordination between the processing facility and the delivery unit, because the delivery unit's route structure has to be known in enough detail at the processing level that the mail can be sorted into the right sequence at the plant. Plant-loaded dispatches have increased as carrier sequence sorting technology has improved. The whole point of automated carrier sequence sorting is to do the sequencing at the plant, where the machines are, rather than at the delivery unit, where carriers would otherwise have to do it manually. When it works well, a carrier arriving at their delivery unit in the morning finds their route mail already in sequence, already in containers sized for their vehicle, essentially ready to load and deliver. This is one of the more elegant pieces of the modern postal system's engineering. It moves the most labor-intensive sorting task from the distributed delivery units, where it would require either more workers or more carrier time, to the centralized processing facilities, where automation can handle it at scale. It also creates a dependency. If the automated sequence sorting fails, if a machine breaks down, if a processing run is incomplete because of volume overloads, the delivery unit receives mail that isn't sequenced, and carriers have to case it manually. On a busy day, this can add an hour or more to a carrier's morning preparation time, which pushes out the entire delivery window. This is the nature of a complex, interdependent system. The efficiencies of integration come with the vulnerabilities of interdependence. When every part works, the whole thing is extraordinary. When one part fails, the failure propagates. There's a geography of the overnight mail system that I find almost meditative to think about. Right now, right at this moment, as you're listening to this, there are postal trucks on the highway in every time zone in the United States. There are mail containers in the belly holds of aircraft crossing the Rockies, crossing the Mississippi, crossing the Appalachians, crossing the Mojave. There are processing facilities running in Seattle and Miami, in Minneapolis and Houston, in Boston and Phoenix. All of them in the same overnight operational cycle. All of them connected to each other by the transportation network we've been describing. The total route miles covered by postal transportation in a single night. All the truck routes, all the contracted cargo flights, all the feeder runs and relay operations and air cargo transfers adds up to a number that's difficult to comprehend in concrete terms. The equivalent of circling the Earth many times over in a single overnight operation. Every night. This is what the country does while it sleeps. It moves its mail. And then, somewhere around 5 or 6 in the morning, the long-haul phase of the overnight operation begins to wind down. The trucks are arriving at their destination facilities. The cargo aircraft are landing. The processing plants are completing their outgoing dispatches. The night shift is handing off to the morning. And the most human, most visible part of the whole operation is just beginning. The last mile. In a delivery unit somewhere in the country, a suburban post office serving a few dozen carrier routes, the lights have been on since 4 in the morning. The dock doors opened at 5 to receive the incoming dispatch from the processing plant. Mail flooded in, letter trays in delivery sequence, flats in delivery sequence, packages in containers and on pallets. The morning sort began immediately, pulling the mail for each route, staging it in the carrier bays, separating what's in sequence from what needs additional handling. The carriers are starting to arrive at 6, some earlier. Letter carriers, in the culture of the Postal Service, tend to be early. Not universally. No profession has universals. But the job selects for people who get things done, who move through space with purpose, who find the rhythm of a familiar route satisfying rather than monotonous. These people tend to be early. They check their cases. They review their route information, the updated delivery sequences, any parcels that need special handling, addresses flagged for various reasons. They sort and sequence anything that needs sorting. They load their vehicles. They organize the trays in the order they'll be needed on the route. And then they go. The carriers disperse into the neighborhoods and the streets and the apartment corridors and the rural roads. And what has been a story of industrial scale and logistical complexity becomes, suddenly, intimate. A letter arriving in a mailbox. A package on a porch. A moment of connection between a sender and a recipient that was made possible by everything we've been describing. The processing facilities and the sorting machines and the trucks and the aircraft and the relay drivers and the dock workers and the dispatchers and the maintenance crews and the transportation managers and all the accumulated knowledge and labor of a 2.5-century-old institution. All of that, to get a letter from one person to another, which when you think about it, is exactly what the system was built for.